Soldiers who knew they were going into a war zone the following day. What was the night before like? Story 1. I'm an officer in the Philippine Army. The night before the first time, it's hard to sleep. I'm rehearsing scenarios in my head, contingency after contingency, ensuring the NCOs in my platoon knows what's up, ensuring the gear is right. So, it was very busy. When I got to bed, I was thinking of my then-girlfriend, telling myself I'd see her again. Wrote up a long message saying how much I love her LOL, but didn't send it for fear of being melodramatic. It was a mixture of excitement and fear, like an athlete training for game day and finally being so close. Actual firefights are hectic. Firefights I've been in have all been in jungles, except for one in a built-up area, so it is in short ranges. Very loud, disorienting, especially if it's your first time. Lots of guys freeze in their first. Luckily, I did not. Shots broke out. I commanded the lead squad to skirmish and return fire, and commanded the rear squad to maneuver to higher ground. I remember hearing nothing but explosions, gunshots, and shouting. I remember hearing the enemy leader's commands and their trash talking. I remember a new private blind firing and his squad leader telling him to quit it. I remember my machine gunner cleaning his weapon mid-firefight because it jammed, and me switching my rifle to full auto so the enemy would think we were laying down MG fire. I remember seeing my wounded soldier after the engagement, and I thought he was dead, and I almost cried right there and then, but I forced myself to do my job first, that is, apply aid and call for medevac. I don't feel fear during a firefight, but always after. Like thinking, I could have died during this moment or that moment, and my knees always started shaking after a fight. But when it is still ongoing, I am ashamed to admit I sort of enjoy it, like playing your favorite sport. This will probably get buried, but I thought to give an insight from an officer's perspective. Story 2. Lying on a cot next to my vehicle in the desert in 2003. We were told we'd be crossing into Iraq at 4 a.m. Everything had been checked, rechecked, and checked again. Made sure all 18 of my guys were loaded up and bedded down. Security was up. I had been up 22 HRs by this point, and finally laid down about 1 a.m. Sleep didn't come. I remember listening to Don't Know Why by Norah Jones on my MP3 player over and over. Teared up a little thinking about my kids. When I finally closed my eyes, it was time to get up and go, and I didn't sleep for 2 more days. Story 3. Slept like a baby. Interestingly, the day before I got blown up, I was absolutely 100% certain I was going to die or lose my left leg. Not a leg. Not a limb. My left leg. I emailed my wife. It wasn't that I was scared. I just knew it somehow. Never felt a feeling of dread, fear, or anything before that night. Had the bomb functioned correctly, I'd be dead, but it didn't, and I lost my left leg. Story 4. Usually preparations and briefings. The first time is always the weirdest. You will most likely be overcome with fear and adrenaline at the same time. To me, it felt like I was being microwaved. The most intense gunfight our unit faced was unplanned and unexpected. Those are the ones that leave the most scars emotionally. Story 5. Was in Kuwait in 2003 waiting to go into country. Was on the border in some tent city. I remember feeling relief. We had been stuck in Kuwait for 6 weeks, sweating absolute and showering once every 3 days, bored out of our fucking minds, eating shitty K rations full of sand from the twice-weekly sandstorms. I was anxious like everyone here describes and did not sleep much the night before. But if I was going to die, just let's fucking go. I was so fucking over sitting in the desert doing nothing, and we had 3-4 false starts. It was like everything else in the army for me. Firing range, demo range, ropes course, rappelling, etc. By the time it actually happened, I just wanted it over with. Story 6. I had a dream where I met my ex-girlfriend's dad, who had died 2 years prior at a coffee shop in heaven. His death really impacted me. He was kind and assuring that I'd be okay and that I would come home. It was surreal. I woke up crying and then boarding a plane later that day for Iraq. Story 7. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I think I slept okay leading up to heading over. I guess I just didn't really know what I was in for. The long, weird nights came once I was already there and couldn't get the images of brains and blown-up children out of my head. That, along with constant middle-of-the-night rocket bombardments, made plenty of sleepless, restless nights. Story 8. I have 2 tours in Iraq. For the first one, I was 19. I didn't know what to expect, and I was excited. I had been training for this moment for a long time and was ready to fulfill my purpose. There was very little fear or anxiety, which quickly changed once in country. My second tour came a year after the end of my first, and my emotions were totally different. I knew what to expect this time and was scared and angry. I was a leader by this point and knew that my responsibility going in was much greater. I always say that the worst day of my life was the first day of my second deployment, knowing that I was at the very start of a year in since I'd already been there, and there was no getting out of it. Story 9. Mostly full of tasks and things to do for preparation. There is always something to do to go with a greater sense of security, and it was also pretty good to occupy myself so that I won't have time for disturbing thoughts. Story 10. Numb and disassociated. 2003. Every single day. For a year. And it was super pronounced if we ever hit up a huge base for a hot meal or a new pair of socks. Everyone there would be gallivanting and playing grab, while we were trying to figure out how long our hillbilly armor would last and wondering if the mail ever came in. I was never able to reset to normal, even after returning to the US. Story 11. Tour in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in a support role, so no frontline fighting for me. For Iraq, we started in Kuwait. I was called up all hours of the night to assist on the teams rolling out to Baghdad. For example, we had the first version of Blue Force trackers. When we got to Kuwait, we had to reprogram them all to use a different satellite. We had one BFT civilian, and he needed help so many 12:02 a.m. nights getting them programmed to roll out on time. It was more anxiousness to get out of Kuwait and get the party started. Tired of mostly sitting around with not much to do. Once it was my time, it was nervousness about the unknown. I don't think I had much fear due to an arrogance or invincibility, but I emotionally disconnected from the real world and family. I don't think those connections really came back either. We lost around 20-30 some odd folks, including one of my college buddies. Worked 6/12s and was on call, so I got woken up at 3-4 a.m. many times to resolve things. Afghanistan was more scary. I was being brought into one of the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan at the time. A lot of IEDs and Taliban presence. I was scared to go. Once I got to my camp, though, it became everyday life and a routine. Rockets at night always missing. A few close calls, a few direct hits on the Afghan army base with casualties that was connected to ours. Had a good team which made the time run pretty smooth. Worked 5 8-hour days and would do a half day on Saturday just in case I had to finish something. Got the gym daily, which was good for mental health. Became stir-crazy and begged to drive for our weekly supply runs to a larger FOB. I was allowed to go until the second person was killed by an IED. I was only allowed to fly anywhere I went from then on. Overall, less stress than Iraq too. We lost 2 close individuals and that haunts me to this day. Best sleep I ever had was in country though. No insomnia. Good, deep sleep even through rocket attacks. Story 12. Well, it's worse than. You don't sleep, you barely eat, you in fear, you shower in fear. You don't get a moment's rest, I tell you what. Never quiet but always scared of the silence. Not knowing what's coming next. Waiting for the next day, hour, minute, second to pass. Hoping you'll get out alive. Not knowing and knowing at the same time. What else is there to say but suffering? Story 13. Edit. This wasn't for knowing we were going into combat the next day, just out to our small fob that we knew took a lot of IDF daily. It was a weird, sleepless night laying on a cot in Bagram with several hundred other soldiers. We were flying out to Sharana the next morning and ultimately our small fob after later the next day. The guys that had deployed previously, mostly NCO, were on top of it. We were ready to go early and they made us go to that late dinner at Bagram and kept saying, enjoy the food while we can. They weren't wrong. We ended up eating frozen salmon and some mystery meat, along with MRE for like every meal for a month. It took years before I could eat salmon after I got out. Story 14. Went in 2014. Had a lady friend come over under the premonition of helping me pack. So naturally, I didn't pack up until an hour before I was supposed to clear the barracks. Sitting around waiting for the buses to the airport, I napped and got smoked for having hickeys. The feeling of, oh, didn't kick in until I got a hug from Hug Lady. Look her up. Probably the only good thing Hood had going for it. And then walking onto the tarmac. Ended up in Romania for about a week, then flew into Afghanistan. Once those doors opened and you feel that ungodly heat and stench, that's when it really hit. I got into a game time mode kind of thought process. The first firefight changed that game mode mindset into, oh, this is really real. And then it was more the adrenaline thinking that my conscious. Towards the halfway point, there was more conscious thought than adrenaline. And finally, towards the end, it was the missions we weren't getting shot at that bothered me. You start thinking, what are they doing? Why aren't they firing? What are they planning? Stuff like that. It was my first and only combat deployment so far. I was just a private, so other people's thoughts are probably different. Story 15. I knew this guy from work who served in Iraq in '03. He said he was really anxious and scared, but at the same time the adrenaline rush was intense. Man is still alive today, probably have PTSD. Story 16. I spent a few nights before going to war zones. As a general rule, those nights were very quiet. People lost in their own thoughts, writing to loved ones, a few making peace with their deities. Some were trying to get their possibly last good night's sleep, others not being able to. Every now and then those awake would get up and wander around a bit. Obviously we'd check, double check, triple check, etc. gear and equipment. But honestly, you can only strip and lube a gun so many times before it's just repetitive. There's usually a low-stakes spades game going on somewhere, but again, it's usually pretty quiet and low-key. I want to point out and stress I was a mechanic going to war with my mechanic unit supporting the infantry and tankers. And the above has been my experience for my units and for my wars. Others, I'm sure, had different experiences. Story 17. I remember being totally fine until a few hours before arrival. I got a super anxious or excited feel, thinking it was going to be a bigger deal than it ended up being. Once we arrived, it quickly became boring. It wasn't until we started doing patrols a week or so later that we saw any sort of action. Story 18. My father was in Desert Storm in Iraq. He said DS was nerve-wracking at first, but after a few weeks was all business. Iraq was just business. The only story he ever told was one time a woman was running towards their convoy screaming. All the kids around him were yelling at her to stop. He took out his rifle and shot without a word. His CO gave him for it, saying there's no way to know if she was an enemy combatant or not. To which he responded, I've seen enough kids come home in body bags to let a CO fresh out of the academy tell me not to shoot when I should shoot. And the way he told it, cold and without a hint of remorse, made me believe him. Story 19. 2 tours in Iraq, 06, 08, and again, 09 to 10. My first tour I was empty inside before we went. I was afraid, but I wasn't sure what to be afraid of, so it just felt like nothing. Prior to leaving the States, I just sat and watched everyone saying goodbye to their families, all of them holding on to each other until the final moment. I was married but asked my wife and family to not attend. I spent the majority of those 15 months doing route clearance and QRF, so I learned what to be afraid of. My second deployment, I can remember my first mission so vivid. My frickin' knees were shaking, literally. Then I remembered how to compartmentalize that fear and kept on moving. And now I spend lots of time unpacking that fear. Story 20, 2006 and 2009 for me, and I slept better in Kuwait, last night before going into a war zone, than the last night in America. Or I should say, at least I got some sleep in Kuwait. You think you won't be back? So I tried to save every second with my family, even though they were sleeping. Most of the guys were hyped up and ready to kill to answer your question. Story 21. I was in Afghanistan from 2011-2012. The night before was tense, but it was a different feeling. A mixture of excitement, anticipation, fear, and worry. But after a couple months in the you kinda get used to it. After my first few firefights, I was just like, this is just how life is. Your emotions change a lot over the course of a year-long combat tour. Story 22. It was a normal day. There were preparations and whatnot, followed by equipment inspection by my NCOs the night prior and the day of. Standard procedure dictates that we get our safety briefing before moving out, and all I remembered thinking was, we're using the same route to return to base. Okay. I was a young enlisted specialist and didn't want to voice my opinion then and there, as there were plenty of NCOs and officers present. I only had to follow orders. Everything went according to plan until our return. I remembered it was roughly noon, and my thoughts were about food and chicken wings at the DFAC dining facility. I remembered looking up at the sky, then at my watch, thinking, man, if they're going to attack, it would be right about. Boom. The DFAC was closed by the time we got back. I had pieces of the shrapnel as souvenir, but no clue where I left them. Uninjured, thankfully. Our vehicle took most of the force, even though it was not properly armored. Story 23. My father was drafted to Vietnam. The day before he was going to be sent to the front lines, he went to the bathroom and cried. He cried because he was scared he was going to die. He cried because he was scared he would leave his mom, my grandma, without either of her kids. Because his brother also was drafted. He cried because it was his fault he flunked out of college and allowed himself to end up this situation. He told me it was the second scariest moment of his life. He has only truly cried twice. His platoon got attacked that first day. He was the only survivor of the attack. He was lying in a foxhole that night, hoping and praying they would not find him. That was the scariest moment of this life. The second time, he truly cried. After that, they gave him a much easier assignment as a secretary. He spent most of the rest of his deployment drinking PBR and other things. He has been dead now for 7 years. Story 24. My squad leader told me we were going out the wire the following morning to conduct a blockade on a bridge in northern Iraq for 2 days. He gave the squad a solid motivational speech that it's been way too long for me to remember. But after that, what I do remember is that he pulled me aside. Since I was the newest in the squad and had no prior deployments, he told me, "Right now you're still alive. Enjoy it. When we leave the wire, just accept that you are already dead and leave the fear behind. When we come back, you can live again." I spent all night thinking about that. It sounds harsh, but I'm so glad he said that to me. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was my mantra from them forward every time I left the wire. There's nothing to fear when you already accepted your fate. But another thing it did for me was let me really enjoy the little small tiny freedoms we had on the base. If I'm in my bunk with no current duties, then that's my time to disconnect and live. Definitely kept me sane. Story 25. Former soldier here. If you are struggling with symptoms of PTSD or thoughts of suicide, please ask for help or call 988. Help is available. Healing is possible. Many of us have lost loved ones to the long-lasting effects of combat. Nobody wants to lose you. Story 26. For me, I was far more nervous leaving for Afghanistan than I was before stepping off to occupy our FOBs and actually get into the fight. I went to Afghanistan in 2008 with 2nd Battalion 7th Marines. Earlier in the year, the worst bombing of the war, at that point, left 100 people dead, and we were on a short turnaround from a deployment my seniors had done in Iraq. Tension was pretty high, and we were prepping for a really rough time. And the lead up to that left me real nervous even if I did everything I could to hide it. When we left Kandahar for what was then known as Camp Bastion, it would later become Camp Leatherneck, I felt pretty safe in my turret. My squad started operating in Gereshk, and most of those nerves went down. Gereshk wasn't particularly hot, and the early weeks of that left me more bored and hot than anything. My squad's first dismounted patrol, I was left behind with a couple others to watch our vehicles, and my squad got into a firefight. Honestly, I remember being jealous, more than afraid. Felt like I missed out. In June, I was on QRF when one of our other squads were hit by a suicide bomber in a busy bazaar. In the confusion and hustle, someone took my turret and I ended up as a dismount in the lead vehicle. I ended up helping move our 2 KIA, the squad leader and an interpreter who slept one bunk over from me. I remember that shook me up real bad. I swore I'd refuse to go out into that bazaar if they tried to send us there again. And one of my seniors who I considered a friend just shrugged and said, "Someone's gotta go. I'd go in your place." That broke something in me, because looking at him I was just like, man, I can't let you go in my place. If you're going, so will I. He had been right there with me loading one of his friends who had been killed into my poncho that day. And if he could still get up and get out there, so could I. He took his own life some years later, unfortunately. Anyway, a couple days later we left on a mounted patrol near the same area we'd just lost guys in, and I was back in my turret. At one point we were stopped. I was sitting real low in my turret when I saw someone on the roof of a building maybe 50 meters away, peeking over, then hiding, and peeking again. Something snapped that moment because, as I called it out and oriented my turret toward that roof, I just remember thinking to myself, fear doesn't serve you here, and letting go. It literally felt like a wave of calm washing over me. Nothing happened. We continued driving on. My squad would later get sent to Sangin, which was the wild fucking west, and things would get way harder from there. But I stopped being scared that day. Even in the heat of a serious firefight with rockets and rounds impacting within feet of my position, I just did not feel the same kind of fear I felt before that moment in my turret. Story 27. The first time, I didn't have any issues. Just didn't really believe in my own mortality or was apathetic to it. It's gotten worse the longer I stay in. And while I wouldn't say I'd be nervous for another GWAT-style war, an actual hot war with a near peer is going to be. I do not look forward to that. Story 28. I was a combat engineer in the Marines in Afghanistan. My job was to clear a path for the infantry, using a metal detector and my eyes to spot IEDs buried in the ground, basically making sure I found them, avoided them, or I got blown up before anyone else. Prior to this op, my job was to just get from point A to point B without dying. That was fine with me because I could just take stupid routes through places I thought they wouldn't plant IEDs, irrigation creeks, agriculture, poppy fields, etc., to minimize the likelihood of getting blown up. This particular op, my job was to clear a landing zone for the medevac chopper we were likely going to use right outside the village, sweep clear areas for other Marines to post security around the village, then go into the village and seek out and dispose, blow up with a stick of C4, of all the IEDs we could find so the local populace could use that side of the village without fear of getting blown up themselves. I didn't sleep the night before. All I could think of was how bad stubbing my toe felt, then multiplying that by 1000x for my impending amputation I was about to endure. I wiggled my toes all night thinking, well, this is my last night with legs. Anxiety was killing me. Ended up not getting my legs blown off, so that was cool. Found 4, missed 1. An army guy embedded in our patrol stepped off my path and got his legs blown off a couple guys back from me. The CO called it a day after that, and we got in a little firefight on the way back to our patrol base. Story 29. So much inventory before was followed by rumors. An ever-present anxiousness to finally do your job and not let your boy down. Once the infantry grunts call you Doc, they own you forever. Story 30. Quiet. Just very, very quiet. Some people mask with enthusiasm. All of us are scared. I was terrified, knowing that I'd possibly end human life that day, committing acts that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It's not something to be celebrated, like others will do who've no experience with it. Story 31. Thoughtful, going over scenarios in my head, resting somewhat, making sure I and others had gotten a good meal, etc., some worry about it, and go over things again and again, but by that stage you should be ready, and you do a final kit check a little before you leave, so best to try and relax. Story 32. There was a decorated general with a heart of gold that likened him to all the stories he told, of past battles, won and lost, and legends of old, a seasoned veteran in his own time. On the battlefield, he gained respectful fame with many medals. Of bravery and stripes to his name, he grew a beard as soon as he could to cover the scars on his face and always urged his men on. But on the eve of a great battle with the infantry in Dream, the old general tossed in his sleep and wrestled with its meaning. He awoke from the night just to tell what he had seen, and walked slowly out of his tent. All the men held tall with their chests in the air, with courage in their blood and a fire in their stare. It was a gray morning, and they all wondered how they would fare, till the old general told them to go home. He said, I have seen the others, and I have discovered that this fight is not worth fighting, and I've seen their mothers, and I will no other to follow me where I'm going. Story 33. Terrible the first time. After a while, you kind of just become numb to it. That's far worse. Waking up and thinking to myself, have I lost my soul? Why can't I make myself care? Then, when you're home safe, that's when the panic and fear kicks in. PTSD is a Story 34. Former artillery officer. Did 2 combat tours in 2014, 2015, and 2017. I left on my first deployment with a child on the way, so I thought about my wife and how I will miss the end of her pregnancy. She probably thinks I'm a bad, and how good the lovin' will be when I get home. I thought about how my son would hear stories of me being a hero, and a huge false sense of grandeur, if anything bad were to happen to me. I felt invincible and had no fear of death or leaving anyone behind. My second deployment came after my son was here, and I had a chance to be a father. I absolutely did not want to leave him or my wife behind now. I felt sad thinking that he could grow up without a father, and my wife without me. They were staying at her sister's in CA so we could save money while I was gone. The most affordable flight to CA was 2 days before I left, so I dropped them off at the airport and cried in the car by myself. I stayed the final night eating pizza and playing video games with my bro, who I was deploying with. We talked about what this deployment would be like and what we knew of the mission, He then went on a Tinder date, and I played World of Warcraft until my wife called that they had landed in CA. Story 35. I recall the day we left our FOB in Kuwait to go into Iraq. I remember hearing the platoon leader's voice coming across the radio telling us to lock and load. I remember the gate guards saluting us on the way out. I remember thinking to myself, none of this is good. Story 36 was in a place where we had rocket mortar attacks regularly. It just becomes a normal part of your life like anything else. Seems weird to acknowledge that now. The night before arriving was just another night for me. Everyone is different though. Saw some guys who were very negatively affected by the experience. Story 37. Back in the early 2000s, I was a helicopter crew chief in the Marine Corps. We were on a boat in the Persian Gulf in the mid-spring timeframe preparing to go in. We knew our orders were to go into Iraq just outside Fallujah for quite some time, so we were watching the news and seeing all the horror stories about the area. The night before we left, we had to get all the helicopters ready, loaded, pre-flighted, and fueled up. We got done before dinner and the Navy made us steak and lobster in the chow hall for our last meal before heading in. That night was filled with jokes and stories and basically anything to keep our minds occupied. We knew where we were headed and didn't want to think about it. Last-minute packing or adjustments to the setup in our birds, or any last-minute briefing with our crews. Other than that, it felt like quiet desperation mixed with bloodthirst. I slept like I did every night on the boat, listening to some mix on my Discman. The next morning before we started flight ops and moving out, we gathered in the hangar and the Navy sang the Marine Corps hymn to us. I had the sense that they knew we were heading into the and some would not be returning. So they gave us a proper send-off. I give the Navy a lot, but that day I could see the love they had for us and vice versa. They were right. 31 of us didn't make it home from that deployment. Story 38. TBH. I was traveling from El Paso, Louisiana, Bangor, ME, Shannon, Ireland, Kuwait City, and then finally into Afghanistan. Everything was such a blur at that point from just being herded along like cattle, I didn't even process what was coming. Even after being in country for a few days, Bagram and Kandahar, it hadn't really set in. But flying low over the mountains in a little prop plane on the way to our FOB was when the danger and where I was really set in. Then, the second realization was when I experienced our first of many mortar attacks. Story 39. I don't even remember. I deployed to Iraq in 2006 in a combat role. I'm sitting here trying to remember what I did the night before or how I felt or much of anything about the process, but I can't. I feel like my brain has pushed so much of it out, probably as a coping mechanism. There was so much going on for me at the time. I was just a few weeks out of basic training and airborne school. I was sent to a unit that had just deployed, and I would be joining them shortly. It was a blur of processing into the unit while also getting ready to deploy. I don't think any of it had hit me, though. I don't think I was scared and it wasn't unexpected, like I joined in a time of peace in a non-combat role and was suddenly told I was being shipped off. I was in the infantry. It was what we had trained for. I feel like I remember when the gravity of the situation hit me, though. We were air assaulting into a terrible area of rural Baghdad, pitch blackout, packed into the back of a roaring Chinook. It was cold out in the middle of winter. We slammed into the ground, were yelled at to get out, and pushed out 20 meters from the helicopter. The Chinook picked up and took off in a screaming cloud of dust. Nothing subtle about it. In an instant, it became eerily quiet as the sound of the Chinooks became fainter in the distance. I remember hearing my heaving breathing and the clanking of a roll of concertina wire that was wrapped in cardboard that I was carrying as it bounced off my weapon, and dogs barking in every direction in the distance, and then viewing the world around me in the green glow of night vision and IR reflections. Man, it definitely hit me then. Story 40. This isn't my experience, but I will chime in since I asked my late father-in-law something very close to this question a long time ago. He was 82nd Airborne and part of the D-Day offensive. I asked how he felt right before the jump and how apprehensive he might have been. He laughed and said there was no room for that because of all the training and preparation that took place beforehand. And he said that everybody was hyped up, mentally prepared, and anxious to get to the fight rather than worrying about all the what-ifs. To all the actual responders here, thank you for your contribution and service. Story 41. The night before I flew out to the Middle East was very busy. I broke up with my girlfriend, calmed down a soldier who was panicking, slathered an entire bottle of aloe on another soldier that had gotten nearly hospitalized from sunburns, enjoying his last day in the States, and had to find body armor for a soldier that had gotten too fat for their body armor in the weeks leading up to deployment. In hindsight, staying busy focusing on other people was a great way to not think about where I was going and what I was about to do. Story 42. So many briefings, getting gear, equipment ready, and then time to sleep. We slept in the plane, wherever we could pull up space around the cargo that would be dropped after we jumped. I put in earphones and played music on my tape recorder and fell asleep pretty quickly. Woke up right as we were about to start readying for jump. Didn't sleep for the next 3+ days. Story 43. I was in the Navy, so it was pretty routine. Iraq really didn't have much of a naval presence. The only thing that was worrying is they deploying sea mines. We caught them early so they didn't get any in place, but we didn't 100% know this for sure. So we had mine watches for a large part of our deployment and came across a few objects that looked very close to a certain mine configuration, and we ran one over. Lucky it wasn't what we thought it was, or a dud, because I'm still here. But I will say, watching us move up on this thing, I definitely had a "this is how I die" moment. Because despite the warning instead of touring, they wanted a picture and ran it over. So yeah, I could have died over a photo. Story 44. PCCs and PCIs. Pre-combat inspections and pre-combat checks. Make sure your dudes are good to go and everyone is ready. No plan lasts, but having a plan is better than nothing. Organized chaos. Story 45. The night before was likely filled with a mix of tension, camaraderie, and reflection. Soldiers may have shared quiet conversations, said private goodbyes. Story 46. Shared a few crayons with my Marine buddies, I was Navy, and washed it down with some glue. Good times. Honestly, there was some anxiety, but not a ton. I think I was a little too young and naive to understand how serious what we were doing really was. Story 47. USMC 1996-2004. No sleep, constant sweats, metal taste in my mouth, heavily adrenalized, thinking about covering my brothers. Check and recheck again my gear. It's been 20 years and I can pop right back to it like it was yesterday. Story 48. For me, it is the nights when I dream that if I had made better decisions, some of my folk would not have died. This wakes me up covered in sweat. Wetting the bed again. Story 49. Combat or war zone? Before combat, it was a lot of rehearsals and checking over gear. Before a war zone, just a normal day TBH, just imagining what type of show we were going into. Story 50. I was a 24-year-old ensign on an IA flying from Kuwait to Bagram, and when loading up to on that C-17 at night was kinda cool. I distinctly remember the flight crew playing Eminem's Forget About Dre on loud. Not the same as going into combat zone since I was in a support role, but I was a bit worried especially during the combat landing when inside a plane that was blacked out, red lights, and just trying the pilot. Story 51. I assume you mean just deploying to a war zone and not specifically the night before going out on a mission. My comments are based on the first point. It's unnerving the first time you go, but you get used to the environment. I wasn't involved in a direct combat role but did 2 tours to Iraq in 2007 and 2008. It's hard to not think about the worst when you don't know what to expect. The first time you hear the sirens go off for incoming ordnance, it can be terrifying, but eventually those don't really get your blood pumping anymore. Short answer. The unknown is what was scary. Once getting established, it wasn't much different than a normal day of work, except for when you got off, you didn't get to go out and do anything fun.